Before we sort of plunge into, a conversation about the book, I'm just curious if you could just tell us more about yourself. Of course, your dean introduced you, but then also how you really arrived, at pursuing this book.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. So, before getting to the book, I'll tell you a bit about my background and how, as you said, I came to do this work. So, my parents immigrated to America from Ghana in West Africa. And when I was a child, I knew I had four career options. I could be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, or a disgrace to the entire family. Ooh. I was bad at math, so engineering was a no-go. The thought of dissecting cadavers makes me want to barf, so being a doctor was not an option. And since I was determined not to be a disgrace, law was the only option left. But I didn't want to be any old lawyer. Ever since I enrolled at UCLA for undergrad, I knew that I wanted to be a change maker, protecting intergenerational wealth in my community. And when I commit to something, I'm all in. I worked myself to the bone and made it to Yale Law School and Harvard's Kennedy School of Government for my graduate studies. I eventually became a law professor, and now all of my scholarly research, writing, and advocacy deals with land stolen from Black people. I do ethnography, so I live and immerse myself in the place I study. And my first ethnographic project was examining land stolen in South Africa during apartheid and colonialism. My first book, We Want What's Ours, Learning from South Africa's Land Restitution Program, examined the psychological, political, social, and economic consequences of getting land or money back. The book was a huge success. At the official book launch, the Deputy Land Claims Commissioner himself attended and publicly announced that the commission planned to implement 90% of my book's recommendations. That first book project, although wildly successful, was uncomfortable for me in many ways because it looked at Black people as victims, Black people being stolen from. So in my next ethnographic project, I wanted to move from Black victimhood to Black agency. And I decided to focus on squatting because this is where vulnerable populations take land instead of being stolen from. Detroit has one of the largest squatting phenomena in recent U.S. history, so I applied for and won a National Science Foundation grant to study it. And that's how I actually got to Detroit in the first place. A squatter is someone who occupies a property without the permission of the record owner. There are two types of squatters. There are takeovers and holdovers, and I interviewed both for my sample. Takeovers are people who occupy a property to which they have no prior legal relationship. On the other hand, holdovers are people who have had a legal relationship to the property as an owner or tenant, for instance, but when the relationship ends, they stay without permission. When I began interviewing the holdovers, one person after the next told me that they lost ownership of their home through property tax foreclosure, but stayed waiting for the new owners to appear. I was like, I knew a lot about mortgage foreclosure, but much less about property tax foreclosure. So I began doing my homework. I soon discovered that since 2009, the local government has confiscated 1 in 3 Detroit homes for failure to pay property taxes. This is the highest number of property tax foreclosures in American history since the Great Depression. Given the gravity of the situation, I switched my research focus from squatting to property tax foreclosure. And I have lived on Detroit's east side since 2017 to understand the city's property tax foreclosure crisis from the perspective of those I live beside. Marisha Brown is one of more than 150 homeowners who I have interviewed for my study. She's a petite brown-skinned woman with a super cute pixie cut. Hers is one of the many stories I tell in my book, Plundered, How Racist Policies Undermine Black Home Ownership in America. One cold winter day, Marisha and I returned to the family home on Bayless Street that she had lost to property tax foreclosure. As we walked towards the house, Marisha said, "Man, I have not been back here since my kids and I were evicted several years back." As soon as we stepped into the yard, we both noticed that the home was vacant. For Marisha, that was a total and complete gut punch because she had worked so hard to ensure that the home did not become a vacant, blighted structure like many of the other homes on the block and in the city of Detroit. As we slowly walked around the home's perimeter, she pointed out all the places she had told me about in the multiple interviews we completed over the years. She said, "This spot right here, this is where our garage used to be. A fire at the house next door burned it down." She said, "That spot right there, that's where my granddad's beloved apple tree used to be. After he died, it died, and it was eventually cut down." As we moved from the backyard to the side of the home, she stopped and peered through the side window to get a better look at the living room where her grandmother, who lived to the age of 102, spent her last days. When I saw Marisha's face turn ashen, I immediately ran over to her side to find out what in the world was going on. We both could not believe our eyes. The pipes in the home had frozen and burst, covering the living room in at least a foot of ice. Marisha wailed, and all I could do was wrap her in a big hug and cry with her. This home on Bayless Street meant so much to Marisha because her grandparents fought hell and high water to acquire it. Despite racial covenants, redlining, blockbusting, urban renewal, and other racist policies, in their retirement, Marisha's grandparents were finally able to purchase this home. It was, without a doubt, their dream home. It was in an area that racial covenants had once made off limits to Blacks. But when whites left to the suburbs, Blacks moved in. The home on Bayless Street was the only asset that Marisha's grandparents had to pass down. But by the time Marisha's grandmother passed away, no other family member even wanted the home because it was no longer a valuable asset. It had become a money pit. The home had broken windows covered with plastic to keep the elements out. There was no functioning shower or bath, and plaster was falling from the ceiling. The other homes on the block were in equally bad shape. When historic and modern-day redlining cut off funds for home improvement, this type of blight is the inevitable result. Given the poor shape of the Bayless Street home, the real question is, why was Marisha so eager to inherit her grandparents' home and so committed to rehabilitating it when other family members wanted nothing to do with it? When I interviewed Marisha for the first time, she shared her life with me and gave me some insight into this quandary. As the oldest child and a woman, she carried back-breaking, caretaking responsibilities on her very narrow shoulders. Marisha told me that not only did she care for her own two children, she also had to care for their father, who was in a wheelchair as a result of a carjacking. She told me she had to care for her sister, who had a debilitating autoimmune disease, along with her sister's child. Marisha also had to care for another sister who had irreversible brain damage, and that sister's young son. Because of our nation's poorest social safety net, women like Marisha are forced to fill the gaps at great cost to themselves. After spending time with Marisha, it became clear to me why she couldn't easily abandon her grandparents' home on Bayless Street. Under no circumstance does Marisha dodge or evade her family responsibilities. No matter how daunting, she takes them head on. Rehabilitating her legacy was not something she wanted to do, it was something she had to do. Some of Marisha's most precious childhood memories happened on Bayless Street. She said, "I remember scooping up the apples that my grandfather shook down from the apple tree. Those were some of the juiciest green apples in the entire city of Detroit." Above all, Marisha is a proud Detroiter who is committed to her city. She did not want the home to become a vacant eyesore like many of the other homes in the city, contributing to the story of Detroit's demise rather than its revival. That's why the day we returned to the Bayless Street home and saw the living room filled with ice, she felt like an utter and complete failure. Marisha failed because individual efforts are no match for broken systems. The saga started when Marisha found a yellow bag attached to her porch. It looked just like this yellow bag right here depicted on the book cover. When she opened the bag, she found a legal notice informing her that the property tax foreclosure process had begun. And if she did not pay her debt by March 31st of the following year, Wayne County would sell her home at its tax foreclosure auction. After she read the notice, she was flooded with emotion. She felt scared. She felt anxious. She felt depressed. And most of all, y'all, she felt shame. She was ashamed because the yellow bag announced to the entire neighborhood that she was behind in her property taxes and about to lose her grandparents' home. But when she looked up, surprisingly, almost every home on her block had a yellow bag attached to the porch. So she knew something was awry, but she didn't know exactly what was going on. When I first met and interviewed Marisha, she blamed herself for losing her legacy. She said, "Well, Professor, I wasn't doing what I was supposed to be doing, clearly." Most city officials that I interviewed also explained the property tax foreclosure crisis with stories of personal irresponsibility. For instance, one official said, "Well, Detroiters just don't want to pay their taxes." Another said, "Well, Detroiters bought homes they couldn't afford." And one official, he even had the audacity to say that Detroiters decided to buy purses instead of paying their property taxes. But my research tells a different story. It's not a story about personal irresponsibility. It's a story of structural injustice. In researching this book, I have interviewed hundreds of homeowners, government officials, and investors. I have combed through reams and reams of property tax assessment data. I've even taken a 9-month course and passed the state exam to become a certified Michigan property tax assessor. My comprehensive investigation shows that between 2009 and 2015, in each of these 7 years, the city of Detroit overvalued between 53 and 84% of its homes in violation of the Michigan State Constitution, which quite clearly states that no home can be assessed at more than 50% of its market value. The lowest valued homes, like the Bayless Street home, were most severely affected. In addition, a Detroit News expose found that the city of Detroit overtaxed homeowners by at least $600 million. Since over 30% of Detroit residents live below the poverty line, many homeowners did not have the money to pay these illegally inflated property taxes. What's worse is they lost homes for property taxes that they were not supposed to be paying in the first place. In Michigan, when homeowners live below the poverty line, they qualify for an exemption. But the city of Detroit erected so many unnecessary barriers that many people never knew about or applied for this entitlement. So yes, tens of thousands of Detroit homeowners face tax foreclosure for property taxes they were not supposed to pay in the first place. It is then no wonder that Marisha saw yellow bags affixed to almost every home on her block. My God, my God. When the local government takes a family's home for failure to pay property taxes, it doesn't just take bricks and mortar. It takes intergenerational wealth. It takes priceless memories. Through the chaos of eviction, people lose precious family photos. They lose grandmama's quilts. They can't recover the height marks that they etched into door frames to mark their child's growth. They're separated from longtime neighbors who had become family. Through property tax foreclosure, people lose so much. Because most of the tax foreclosed homes had been inherited and were fully paid off, homeowners blamed themselves for losing mama's house or losing granddaddy's house. If there was a mortgage on the home, the bank would have taken it before the local government could. During the interviews that I conducted of tax foreclosed homeowners, there was so much shame and self-lambasting that when the interview was over, I called many people back. I said, "You know what, sis?" I said, "You know what, my brother? There is no reason to feel shame. Systemic injustice was hidden in the complex property tax calculations. Racist policies put you in a position of trying to slay a dragon with a butter knife." According to my dear brother, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, who's here with us today, racist policies are written and unwritten laws and processes that produce or sustain racial inequity. The way property taxes are administered in Wayne County undoubtedly qualifies. Wayne County has 43 cities, 33 of which have a supermajority, which is 70% or more of white people, and 3 have a supermajority of black people, Detroit, Inkster, and Highland Park. The majority black cities are overtaxed and foreclosed upon at a far greater rate than the majority white cities. This is racial injustice. But this injustice is not exclusively a Detroit problem. Detroit is ground zero for a national problem. A national study shows that blacks and Hispanics pay a 10 to 13% higher property tax rate than whites, which equals about $300 to $400 more per year. Racialized property tax administration is a nationwide problem that America has not yet begun to address. And most importantly, this is a quintessential example of what in my book Plundered I call predatory governance, which is when local governments intentionally or unintentionally raise public dollars through racist policies. We've seen predatory governance in Ferguson, Missouri. Beyond what happened to Michael Brown, there was an excellent DOJ report documenting how police in Ferguson engaged in unconstitutional policing by unfairly subjecting African Americans to excessive fines and fees. Who benefited financially? Not any police officer, but the city of Ferguson itself. Predatory governance is what's happening in Detroit and many other cities where local governments are inflating the property taxes of black and brown homeowners. Who financially benefits? Not any corrupt public official, but instead public coffers. Just as Detroit is ground zero for this national problem, Detroit is also the epicenter of the resistance, okay? Once my research exposed the hidden structural problems, this information lifted the shame, allowed homeowners to stop beating themselves up, and made room for righteous indignation so that the fight back could begin. In 2017, my students and I joined with over a dozen grassroots community organizations in Detroit to create something called the Coalition for Property Tax Justice. We have 3 goals. First is to stop the inflated property tax assessments in Detroit and throughout the nation. Second is to stop the ongoing foreclosures of owner-occupied homes in Detroit until local officials can ensure that the illegally inflated property tax assessments have stopped. And third is to provide compensation. By building community power, we have been able to secure several significant wins. We have halted roughly 13,000 tax foreclosures by pressuring the Wayne County Treasurer to place a moratorium on owner-occupied homes in 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, and most recently in 2024. We have helped over 1,000 Detroit homeowners successfully apply for a total of $4.4 million in federal ARPA funding to pay their illegally inflated property tax debt. We have appealed the inflated property tax assessments for over 1,000 Detroit homeowners free of charge. We've even secured $6 million from the city of Detroit for compensation. But most importantly, through the Dignity Restoration Project, we are raising $10 million to compensate the hardest hit Detroiters like Marisha, who lost their homes to tax foreclosure due to illegally inflated property taxes that they weren't supposed to be paying in the first place because they qualified for the property tax exemption. You all can go to dignityrestorationproject.org to donate. Again, that's dignityrestorationproject.org to donate. Your contribution sends a message saying, I see you and I affirm your dignity to Marisha and the other 30,000 people who the local government unfairly took their homes for property taxes they weren't supposed to be paying in the first place. To conclude, I'm glad that I did not become an engineer. I'm glad that I did not become a doctor. I'm glad that I became a lawyer fighting against the theft of Black homes, fighting to protect our intergenerational wealth and dignity. Both of my parents have gone on to glory, but I know they are smiling down on me because I have managed not to disgrace them. Ooh. But more importantly, And more seriously, people in Detroit and throughout the country who are filled with shame because they're fighting a losing battle against racist policies, they are not a disgrace either.